Okay, in this video we're going to pick up where we left off with the 1920s and go into kind of a darker part of our history with the Great Depression and look at how did we get ourselves into this, what was some of the roles of the government during this time, and then again, how do we get ourselves out of it. All right, so the causes of the Great Depression. Most of you probably heard that the cause was this great big stock market crash in 1929 and everything went downhill from there, where actually that was just a catalyst to a number of things that were going on before that. Some of your other causes are going to be unrestricted trade, where we had high tariffs that were passed, and as you remember, tariffs are taxes on imported goods, and so when you have high tariffs, maybe other countries, people don't buy your goods if you're selling to the US from other countries, so they don't want to trade with us as much, and so this is going to cause a major issue. Also during this time, you're going to have some banking that's not going to go so well. Remember, we had a lot of issues in the early 20th century with farmers being in debt and not be able to pay back loans. We're also going to have even things happening that are a result of World War I, where you had Germans that were required to pay money back to Europeans, and the Europeans used the German money to pay back the U.S. for loans, so these loans were kind of tricky and weren't really sound for our economy. Uh, the other thing with the stock market is going to be speculation, where you're going to have this huge jump in the stock market and you're going to have this what we call buying on margin. And that's kind of like when you buy on credit. It's so if I buy on margin, then I'm going to buy it for, say, a 10% down payment, and then I'm going to, and then it would be a loan from the stockbroker for the other 90%, and then you would pay the rest of the money when the stock is sold. So whenever let's say you got $2,000 in shares, so you only paid $200 for $2,000 worth of shares. Let's say you sell it and it's $4,000 when you share it, where you got to pay the bank back the rest of the money, which would be about $1,800, and you got to keep the rest. So that was kind of the whole idea of buying on margin. So when you did all of this and you're hoping and you're speculating and you're hoping that the stock market's going to keep going up, then it's not going to help out whenever it actually crashes. So of course the big catalyst is 1929 when the stock market crashes. So if you notice from this graph right here is about the peak in 1929, and you notice it's not a bottoming out. This would be in a very short amount of time, and it's kind of the beginning of this dip for the Great Depression. So when you notice that actually the lowest is, mid 1932 and not necessarily in 1929, that was just kind of the start of it. And again, you only have a small percentage of Americans that are affected by the stock market, but because of this crash, it's going to, corporations can't raise money. People are going to lose their money in the stock market, and then they can't pay back their loans or rents, and then it's going to lead to bank failure. So it kind of led to a trickle-down effect, and so that's why they consider this the big catalyst to the entire depression. Another major event that happens in this time that probably doesn't help is the Dust Bowl. And the main things you need to know for the Dust Bowl is more of the geographic effects. So what led to the Dust Bowl, part of it was poor farming practices, not doing proper crop rotation. So you wore out the soil and the topsoil became very loose and where it could be dusty. And then you had a prolonged drought in the area. And due to this, it led to these huge dust clouds. It led to a lot of farmers, mostly in like the panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, that area, that were going to be homeless, and it's going to lead to a huge migration, and especially out to California in hopes for better jobs. So here is a visual of a big dust cloud during the Dust Bowl, and just thinking of the major geographic impact of something like this. And so again, this was paired along with the Great Depression with unemployment, and now you have it's affecting agriculture at this time. So it's not even just corporations and the corporate side of the world, it's also everyday Americans and even your farmers. The major effects of the Great Depression. So we're going to end up with widespread unemployment. It gets to some points around 25%. Now, modern day, our current unemployment rate's around 8%, 8 or 9%, which we sometimes think is high. 25% is huge. 1 in 4 Americans could not find work. In some cities, you had unemployment all the way up to 80%, and these were in some of the more industrial cities where you saw this. Also, there was a change in opinions about self-reliance during this time, and we'll kind of talk more about that when we look at how the government gets involved. You're also going to have an unintended consequence is going to be deportation and repatriation of European and Mexican heritage, of people of those heritages. And some of that is, again, that idea of if we have all these immigrants here, they're going to take the lower paying jobs and keep Americans from getting jobs. So they wanted to reduce that. So when you have this widespread unemployment, yet people couldn't pay their rents, so they had to find ways to live, and so they start creating things like like this. This is what we call a Hooverville. They call it a Hooverville because that was the president at the time, and this is actually in Central Park, New York City. So if you've ever been to Central Park, it's a very pristine place, very pretty today. Think of that park filled with these shacks and where people had to live because they couldn't afford rent in housing during this time. So reactions to the Great Depression, there's going to be two different reactions. There's going to be Hoover, who's president from 1929 to about 1933, and then Roosevelt, who's president from 1933 to 1945. So Hoover's response is going to be more of this idea called rugged individualism. Remember, he is somebody that supports laissez-faire, where the business cycle just takes its natural course and the government doesn't get involved and just let it fix itself, let it work itself out. And so he felt like if the government tried to help the unemployed and the needy too much, it would reduce their incentive to work and an American rugged individualism. So he believed more in private organizations providing emergency relief rather than the government providing relief. He realizes pretty quickly that that's not going to work, that this isn't going away anytime soon, that something's going to happen or you're going to have a huge disaster on your hands, worse than it was. So he finally responds towards the very end, but of course it's an election year, and it ended up pretty much the whole idea of Hoover is it was too little, too late, is kind of when you think of Hoover's response in a nutshell. So he has these few things: Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He tries to cut taxes. He tries to increase federal spending. Those were kind of the last ditch efforts before he voted out of office. Something else that's going to kind of tarnish Hoover with his presidency is the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised tariffs significantly during this time. And that's going to, again, it's going to stifle the economy, and a lot of people feel like it kind of helped contribute to the duration of the Great Depression. So obviously with Hoover, too little, too late, didn't do enough. After he leaves office, we have Roosevelt coming in, and he has kind of a different approach to how we should take care of what's going on. So he had what we call the program of relief, recovery, reform. So he starts with relief, and the goal is supposed to be relief for persons in need by providing them with money and loans to make mortgage payments or jobs. So some different examples of this, the bank holiday, and doing this after the banks fell. He gave relief for home and farm owners, such as the Federal Housing Administration. So sometimes like today, whenever you see certain things for government-funded housing, that kind of comes from this idea. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which gave jobs to men, and they were doing things like planting trees and cleaning up forests. They lived in camps and they got free food, and then their pay was sent to their parents. You have the Public Works Administration, which is going to create jobs by building public projects such as schools, roads, etc. I know in my hometown we have our whole downtown is paved with bricks, and so those brick streets were one of these public works projects. You also have the Works Progress Administration, which is going to hire artists, writers, musicians. They're going to go and paint murals in post offices. They're going to go and collect stories from former slaves and slave narratives. So different things like that. They're going to have a writer's project during this time. So again, this was to try to provide relief, money to kind of help with housing and loans, but also to try to find jobs. Next step with the New Deal is going to be recovery. And the goal for recovery is this is recovery for the nation. And they're going to pass legislation to assist businesses, labor, and agriculture. So some of the programs they're going to have for recovery programs is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And this one's going to pay farmers to plant actually less food to try to lead to more demand and crop prices going up. This one's going to end up being pretty controversial. It's going to lead to what we find out is the court packing plan and some of the issues with the Supreme Court during this time. It's going to have two different levels. The first one's found unconstitutional, and then they're going to try again with raising farm prices, and try to store food in warehouses to lead to prices going up. Another one that's going to be a recovery program is the National Recovery Administration, and they're going to ask businesses to voluntarily follow codes to set standard prices, production limits, and a minimum wage. This is another one that the Supreme Court finds unconstitutional because they felt like the government doesn't really have any right to interfere with business activities conducted within a state. So both of these are going to be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And we're going to see the issues with that here in a little bit. So both of these were intended to help recover the country. They tried to do a little bit of price control, which we felt like, well, the Supreme Court and some Americans felt like it was being too controlling from the government. And the next one, the reform. And the goal of the reform movements is to, you're going to reform programs to keep from having the same problems happen again. So reform is programs to hopefully ensure another depression doesn't happen. And some of these we still have today. For example, the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This insures bank accounts. So when you go put your money in the bank and the bank goes down and fails, you are insured up to, I believe at one point it was $100,000. It may be more now. $100,000 that you would get that money back, at least that amount of money back. So that's the idea of the FDIC, is to try to counteract if an insurance or if a bank fails. The Tennessee Valley Authority was where they built a bunch of dams in the Tennessee Valley. And it was to control floods, produce electricity. Some people didn't like it because, again, you had property owned by the government and created that affected a lot of people. Another one that we really have a lot of impact on is still today, Securities and Exchange Commission. And this was created to monitor the stock market. So, again, trying to watch out for that stock market speculation. And it was also to prevent another stock market collapse. Something that you will see in your paychecks if you don't already work, you see it coming out of your paychecks if you do work, is Social Security Act. And this is to provide, this is to give funds or support for those over 65, for people that are retired, so retirees. So this is it also has unemployment insurance part of it. If you are retired or once you turn 65, you start getting a Social Security check. And so this was to kind of supplement your income and as a supplement to your savings after you retire or when you're older. Another one from this is the National Labor Relations Act, and this is sometimes called the Wagner Act, and it gave workers the right to form unions. So this one is related to being able to provide unions for workers' rights, and they can bargain collectively for their benefits or salary, those kinds of things. So this one had a lot to do with labor support.